Andy, every once in a while, Aaron would come down to the set and say, the show's running a little short.
Over the top? No, we had no over-the-top rules. We were totally reasonable, thoughtful parents who made solid decisions at every turn. Harrison is an intellectual, but I think he leads with instinct and his kind of natural sense of who he is.
At 71, Ron Howard has finally broken his silence. But instead of nostalgia and heartwarming stories, what he revealed sent shockwaves through fans who thought they knew him.
You know, I'm less tired at the end of a movie now as a director than I was in my 30s.
Behind the smile, behind the wholesome image, Howard's truth is darker, messier, and far more complicated than anyone expected.
A lot of the stress and strain of trying to put a fine point on it on the set is gone. You can do that later. You can do it in post. You can refine it.
The question is, after all these years, why is he choosing to speak out now? And what is he really hiding? Let's find out. The Andy Griffith Show might have ended in 1968, but the drama behind Mayberry never really died. Fans still obsess over its small-town charm, but what they don't always see are the feuds, secrets, and grudges that played out behind the cameras. Now, at 70, Ron Howard is finally pulling back the curtain on the show everyone thought was wholesome and innocent. From shocking set secrets to bitter rivalries between cast members, we're digging into who couldn't stand each other, which moments Ron Howard hated the most, and the one thing that made him resent his time on the show.
I was under contract at Columbia Pictures for $150 a week, which back in those days was still only $150 a week.
The so-called perfect American sitcom starring Andy Griffith and Don Knotts aired for 8 seasons from 1960 to 1968. But don't let the laughter fool you. What was really happening on that set tells a very different story. Throughout its run, The Andy Griffith Show dominated television, never dropping below 7th place in the Nielsen ratings and even ending as the #1 show in America. On the surface, Mayberry seemed like the perfect small town. Sheriff Andy Taylor, played by Andy Griffith, kept the peace with a calm, common-sense approach to law enforcement. But while the town looked picture perfect, both on-screen and off, not everything was as wholesome as it appeared. The series leaned heavily on stereotypes of small-town life. The wide-eyed gas station attendant Gomer Pyle, Jim Neighbors, the lovable drunk Otis, Hal Smith, and of course the bumbling deputy Barney Fife, played to perfection by Don Knotts. Knotts' performance earned him 4 Emmys, but his sudden departure in 1965 fueled whispers of tension behind the scenes. Was it really just a career move or something more personal between Knotts and Griffith?
I had a 5-year contract, and during the 5th season, I thought, geez, I better start looking around for more work.
Then there was Aunt Bee, brought to life by Frances Bavier. While she played the sweet, old-fashioned caretaker on screen, rumors swirled that she clashed with the cast, especially Griffith himself. Some say the tension got so bad she kept to herself in later seasons. And even after the show ended, she distanced herself from the rest of Mayberry's stars. And don't be fooled by Griffith's serious persona as the sheriff. Off camera, he was infamous for his pranks, some playful, others downright cruel. Don Knotts often found himself the butt of Andy's antics, woken up from naps by loud crashes or startled by film canisters thrown to the floor. George Goober Lindsay once discovered duck guts hanging in his dressing room, courtesy of Griffith. The cast eventually got their revenge by stealing Andy's shoes, forcing him to walk out in his oversized sheriff boots, a humiliating sight for a man who liked to be in control. Even the show's sweet father-son moments had darker undertones. Ron Howard, who played Opie, later admitted there were times he hated being the cute kid in a grown-up world. For all its laughs, the show carried a quiet tension, as if Mayberry's picture-perfect image was being held together by duct tape and forced smiles.
You know, it was so much a function of a kind of singular creative voice. Not that Andy wrote, he wasn't didn't have a producer.
And here's the kicker, that cheerful whistled theme song, it was written in just 15 minutes. A classic born from spontaneity, fitting for a series that hid chaos behind its small-town charm. For decades, fans knew the Andy Griffith Show theme song as nothing more than that cheerful little whistle. But here's the twist. There are actually lyrics. The tune, officially titled The Fishing Hole, was recorded by none other than Andy Griffith himself. Written in under 15 minutes by Herbert Spencer and Earl Hagen, the song had full verses that most fans never even knew existed. To some, it felt almost ironic. Lyrics about simplicity and innocence attached to a show where things behind the scenes were anything but simple. What was genuine, though, was the bond between Andy Griffith and Don Knotts. Unlike many TV partnerships built on contracts and convenience, these two were inseparable. Their friendship began in the 1950s on Broadway during No Time for Sergeants and lasted until Knotts' death in 2006, with Andy literally by his side in his final days. In an industry full of fake smiles and backstabbing, theirs was one of the rare Hollywood friendships that wasn't just for show.
Andy suddenly said he was going to stay on another 2 or 3 years. Well, I'd already cast my lot, I guess.
But not every relationship on set was that authentic. Andy Griffith, despite his charming Southern persona, was notoriously uncomfortable with on-screen romance. Eleanor Donahue, cast as Ellie Walker, his first love interest, found out the hard way. The chemistry just wasn't there, and Eleanor eventually asked to be released from her 3-year contract after only 1 season. Andy himself admitted he struggled with affection on camera, and the result was a love story that felt forced. Without explanation, Ellie Walker simply disappeared from Mayberry, another casualty of Griffith's private hang-ups bleeding into the show. Even little Ron Howard wasn't immune to the behind-the-scenes quirks. Remember the opening credits, where Opie tosses a rock into the lake? Here's the secret. Ron never actually hit the water. Filmed at Franklin Canyon in 1960, the young actor missed the throw, and editors had to work their magic to sell the illusion. For a show that prided itself on simple, honest living, even the most iconic moment was staged. 6-year-old Ron Howard may have been a natural when it came to delivering lines, but not everything came so easily. That famous shot of Opie tossing a rock into the lake? Pure Hollywood trickery. Ron was too young and too weak to pull it off. So a prop man hid in the bushes and threw the rock for him. The moment fans believed for decades was real was actually staged. Yet another reminder that even the most wholesome show on television was built on illusion. And then came the real bombshell, the disappearance of Don Knotts' beloved character, Barney Fife. Many fans assumed he simply left for movie roles, but the truth is far messier. From the very beginning, Andy Griffith told Knotts and the rest of the cast the show would run for only 5 seasons. Everyone signed contracts based on that promise. So when season 5 rolled around, Knotts made his move. He locked down a 5-film deal with Universal, confident Mayberry was about to close shop. But then, at the last minute, Andy caved to network pressure and agreed to extend the series, not for 1 season, but 3. Knotts was left high and dry, already locked into a movie contract. Fans thought Barney's exit was just creative direction, but behind the scenes, it was the result of Andy Griffith breaking his word.
I hadn't really signed, but I had said I would, and I had focused all my attention in that direction. And
even the running gag about Barney only carrying 1 bullet wasn't just comedy. It reflected Andy's real-life concerns. He reportedly insisted on the 1-bullet rule because he didn't trust the character, or Knotts, to handle a gun on screen without it turning into slapstick chaos. The joke became so iconic that fans actually mailed Don Knotts real bullets. While some saw it as a sweet gesture, others whispered it was a darker symbol, America's love for guns colliding with Mayberry's supposed innocence. The cars on the show also carried more controversy than fans realized. Sheriff Taylor's squad cars were always Fords, not out of character choice, but sponsorship. Ford provided fresh models to the set every season, ensuring Andy Griffith was driving the newest Galaxy 500 sedans. To some critics, it was the first crack in Mayberry's down-home charm, proof that even the simplest town on TV was quietly selling cars to America. As for Don Knotts' favorite episode, The Pickle Story, fans adored the silliness of Andy and Barney trying to ditch Aunt Bee's inedible pickles without hurting her feelings. Knotts later admitted it was one of the funniest episodes to shoot, but here's the kicker. Frances Bavier, who played Aunt Bee, allegedly hated being the butt of the joke. While the audience laughed, she reportedly felt humiliated, adding fuel to the fire of her strained relationships with her co-stars.
I know your pickles would stand a wonderful chance. Here, let me try one.
Nicknames were everywhere on the Andy Griffith Show, on screen and off. Don Knotts came up with one for Andy that stuck like glue. Ange, a mashup of Andy and Griffith. It was so natural that Knotts used it instinctively, both while filming and in private conversations. To audiences, it might have sounded like he was saying "and," but insiders knew it was a little wink to the man behind the sheriff's badge. Not every behind-the-scenes story was lighthearted, though. Howard McNear, who played Floyd the Barber, suffered a debilitating stroke during the series. Instead of writing him off, the crew got creative, hiding his paralysis in plain sight. They propped him up with specially designed stools, leaned him against sets, or simply parked him in his barber chair. If you look closely at later episodes, you'll see it. Floyd never moves his left hand. To fans, he was still the quirky barber of Mayberry. To the cast, it was a constant reminder of how fragile life was behind the sitcom smiles. Meanwhile, Don Knotts was making Barney Fife's iconic salt and pepper suit famous. The mismatched suit, red bow tie, and white hat became his uniform for social occasions on the show. Knotts loved it so much, he wore it in multiple films afterward. The Ghost in Mr. Chicken, The Reluctant Astronaut, The Incredible Mr. Limpet, and more. It was less a costume and more a piece of his identity. But here's where things got messy. Andy Griffith may have played the straight-laced small-town sheriff on TV, but his off-screen life wasn't so wholesome. When actress Annetta Corso was introduced as Helen Crump, she was only supposed to appear in one episode. Her sharp performance and that humorously clunky last name won her a bigger role, but she also won Andy Griffith's attention. Despite being a married man, Andy was rumored to have carried on an affair with Annetta. The whispers started quietly, passed between crew members, but soon the gossip spread beyond the set. To the public, Helen Crump was Andy Taylor's prim and proper love interest. Behind the scenes, some say Annetta was Andy Griffith's real-life passion, one he tried to keep hidden from both his wife and the press. Griffith's influence on the Andy Griffith Show stretched far beyond his role as Sheriff Taylor. When Annetta Corso, Helen Crump, entered the picture, it was Andy himself who reportedly demanded she be written in as a series regular. Insiders whispered it wasn't just about her acting talent, it was about keeping his rumored off-screen romance conveniently close to him on set.
Oh, hello, Sheriff.
Now, my first name's Anthony.
Andy.
How are you, Miss Ellie?
Meanwhile, Floyd the Barber, played by Howard McNear, became one of Mayberry's quirkiest characters. His absent-minded, slow delivery was both funny and unsettling, especially after his stroke left him partially paralyzed. To hide his condition, the crew propped him up with stools and benches. But eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed another bizarre detail. Floyd's barbershop calendar was permanently stuck on February. Was it a clever inside joke about Floyd's forgetfulness, or just sloppy set design? Either way, it became one of those eerie little quirks that fans still debate. Behind the business curtain, Andy was no small-town pushover. He was a shrewd negotiator. When producers Sheldon Leonard and Danny Thomas first pitched him the pilot, Griffith made one bold demand. He wanted 50% ownership of the show before he'd agree. That single decision made him millions. By the time of his death, Griffith's net worth hovered around $35 million, cementing him not just as Mayberry's sheriff, but as one of Hollywood's smartest power players. But money and power didn't erase Andy's darker side. Though fans adored his genial, easygoing persona, Griffith was known to have a fiery temper. During the filming of Season 2, his frustration hit a breaking point. In a fit of rage, Andy punched a wall so hard he broke his hand. The wholesome sheriff of Mayberry wasn't always as calm and collected as he appeared. Sometimes the man America trusted to keep the peace couldn't even keep control of himself. Andy Griffith's temper wasn't just a rumor. It was a real problem. One infamous outburst ended with several of his fingers fractured after he smashed his hand in anger. The injury was so bad it nearly derailed filming. To save face, producers scrambled to spin a cover story, writing a convenient subplot where Andy hurt his hand chasing down criminals. In reality, it was Griffith's own fury that forced the writer's hand, literally.
He was the boss of the show, for the most part, and in a very good way. Excellent person, nice person. He has said since they didn't know how to write for me.
And then there's Don Knotts. Believe it or not, the man who became America's favorite bumbling deputy was almost a one and done. When he first showed up, Knotts didn't even have a contract. He was technically a temp. But once the producers saw the undeniable chemistry between Knotts and Griffith, they rushed him a one-year deal. If they hadn't, Barney Fife might have disappeared before Mayberry even noticed he was there.
Just went ahead. But I was very... It was a tough time for me because I enjoyed the Griffith Show.
But perhaps the darkest chapter belongs to Floyd the Barber. Actor Howard McNear's health was in rapid decline after a stroke, and the producers were forced to quietly write him out. The official story was that Floyd retired rich. The truth? McNear was fading fast, and the show didn't want the audience to see it. He died shortly after leaving, and in a cold move, the studio filled the void with a replacement character, Emmett Clark, played by Paul Hartman. To many fans, it felt like Floyd's memory was erased overnight. Even Andy and Barney's relationship wasn't safe from revision. At first, the two were written as cousins, a wink at the good old boy politics of small-town government jobs handed to family members. But when audiences fell in love with their buddy chemistry, the writers quietly scrubbed the family angle and rebranded them as lifelong pals. Still, cracks in the story remained. Barney frequently referenced his parents, never once connecting them to Andy's family. Aunt Bee herself even flat out told Andy more than once, "Barney is your friend," a subtle but deliberate correction. In the end, the wholesome image of the Andy Griffith Show was carefully curated smoke and mirrors. Behind the smiles and small-town charm were health struggles, contract gambles, rewrites, and a leading man with a dangerous temper. When the Andy Griffith Show first hit the air, Andy Griffith was supposed to be the clown, the wisecracking small-town sheriff delivering the punchlines while everyone else played the straight man. But that idea crashed and burned almost instantly. Why? Because Don Knotts showed up and stole the spotlight. His natural, frantic, bug-eyed humor made it painfully obvious that Griffith wasn't the funny one. Knotts was. By the second episode, Griffith knew the truth. He had to step aside and play the straight man while Knotts carried the comedy. It wasn't a creative choice. It was survival.
But I hated to leave. I never expected it to go on.
Griffith himself admitted years later that the shift happened fast, but the tension was always there. Watching Knotts score the laughs while he stood by with a smirk must have stung. And Knotts? He knew exactly what he was doing. He even revealed his secret weapon, getting Andy to almost break character. Andy found Barney funny, Knotts once said. Translation? Griffith couldn't keep up, so Don used his co-stars' barely suppressed laughter as fuel to push scenes over the edge. But here's the kicker. While the on-screen partnership looked warm and effortless, behind the curtain, Griffith was losing his grip on control of his own show. What started as Andy's vehicle quietly transformed into Don Knotts' comedy playground. Andy had to settle for being the calm, fatherly anchor, while Barney got the glory. The producers were just as ruthless in controlling the show's destiny. Fearing audience burnout, or perhaps terrified that the behind-the-scenes cracks were starting to show, they pulled the plug after 8 seasons, while ratings were still sky-high. In fact, The Andy Griffith Show is one of only 3 series in TV history to end its run ranked #1, alongside I Love Lucy and Seinfeld. But unlike those other juggernauts, Griffith never walked away with the same cultural crown.
I hated to leave. I never expected it to go on.
And here's the part nobody likes to say out loud. Despite being the star of the show, Griffith himself never won a single Emmy. Not one. Meanwhile, Don Knotts walked away with 5, and Frances Bavier, Aunt Bee, added another for herself. The supporting cast ate while the supposed king of Mayberry went home empty-handed. So, yes, the show ended on top. But ask yourself, was it really Andy Griffith's triumph? Or was he just the straight man in a sitcom that stopped being his almost as soon as it began? On screen, Andy Griffith and Frances Bavier, Aunt Bee, radiated warmth, but off-camera it was a cold war. Bavier considered herself a serious dramatic actress, classically trained, dignified, and utterly unamused by Griffith's endless pranks and good old boy humor. She reportedly found his behavior childish, even disrespectful, and she made no secret of her disdain. For years, the tension was palpable on set, and insiders whispered that their mutual dislike nearly derailed certain episodes. The reconciliation story often told, Bavier reaching out to Andy shortly before her death, feels less like heartfelt closure and more like a final truce between 2 co-stars who never truly got along. It wasn't a friendship, it was damage control at the very end.
And the Andy Griffith Show, and for a moment he was like the comedy producer, but he was there all the time, and they were always stressing character, and Andy used to kill jokes.
Meanwhile, Griffith himself was weaving his Southern identity into the fabric of the show, using old expressions like, "that's the time," "nar a thing," and "tick-a-lock." To fans, it came off as charming authenticity. To critics, it was Griffith stamping his personal brand on every inch of the series, blurring the line between character and ego. Even the iconic opening credits, Andy nodding in approval at little Opie's stone toss, wasn't just folksy TV magic. That nod was a direct imitation of Griffith's real father, a subtle tribute that quietly reminded everyone whose show this really was. But perhaps the most controversial power play came behind the curtain. At the height of the show's success, Don Knotts, already already showered with Emmys and fan devotion, asked for a 4-part ownership stake in the Andy Griffith Show. He wanted in on the empire he helped build. Griffith flatly refused. Decades later, Andy let slip a private anecdote about Knotts to his manager, one that painted a far less rosy picture of their brotherly relationship. The truth seems clear. As much as audiences loved the sheriff and his deputy, behind the scenes it was a minefield of bruised egos, hurt pride, and power struggles that never fully healed.
He didn't like Petticoat Junction and not Hillbilly Elegy, that's a movie I directed. He didn't like Beverly Hillbillies.
By season 5, the cracks were showing. Don Knotts wasn't just the lovable deputy audiences adored, he was a man with demands. He confided to Andy that he'd consider returning to the sitcom, but only if he was given a real piece of the pie. Ownership. Not just a paycheck, not just Emmy statues. Equity. But Griffith wasn't budging. He and his manager held the lion's share of ownership, and they weren't about to cut Knotts in. No matter how close their friendship seemed, Don was still just a salaried employee on the Andy Griffith Show. Griffith kept the empire in his pocket, and Knotts walked away. Their on-screen friendship may have been warm, but off-screen it ended with cold business. And here's the twist most fans never realized. Griffith and Knotts were nothing like their Mayberry counterparts in real life. Both came from modest rural roots. Both carved their names into comedy through the 1950s stand-up circuit. They even built their early chemistry on Broadway in No Time for Sergeants. On screen, Andy played the calm and patient sheriff, and Don delivered manic, neurotic energy as Barney Fife. But behind the camera, the roles flipped. Griffith was the calculating operator, while Knotts carried himself with surprising seriousness, far removed from the bumbling deputy the world thought they knew. Then there's one of Mayberry's deepest mysteries, Opie's missing mother. Little Opie was 6 years old at the start, living in a picturesque small-town home with his widowed father Andy and his Aunt Bee. But the show went out of its way to bury the memory of his late mother. She's mentioned only once in the episode Wedding Bells for Aunt Bee, when Andy recalls his lost love in a fleeting moment of nostalgia. No photo, no name, no backstory, nothing.
That's very kind of him to say. I don't think I didn't give them anything to write for, but that was his excuse
For a series so obsessed with small-town values, this glaring omission left fans whispering for decades. Why was Opie's mother erased so thoroughly? Was it a storytelling oversight? Or did Griffith deliberately keep her absent to preserve the father-son fantasy that made him the heart of Mayberry? The truth about Opie's mother is even murkier than fans realize. While the Andy Griffith Show avoided the subject almost entirely, the answer slipped out. Not in Mayberry, but in the Danny Thomas Show, the very series where Griffith's sheriff first appeared. In that crossover episode, Andy admits that Opie's mother died when the boy was still an infant. Yet for 8 full seasons of the Andy Griffith Show, the subject was swept under the rug, as if the widowed sheriff's loss was too heavy for Mayberry's carefully crafted down-home charm. It was a calculated erasure, one that kept the focus on the father-son bond but left fans wondering, was Andy Taylor's late wife simply too inconvenient for the fantasy world the producers were selling?
What qualities do you want in your next sheriff?
And then there's Ron Howard, the golden boy of Mayberry, who grew up under America's watchful eye. While fans adored little Opie, Ron himself carried a very different memory of his time on set. His most hated moment, the now famous Pickle Story episode. On screen, it was a goofy little plot about Aunt Bee's disastrous homemade pickles, which Opie and Andy struggle to eat politely. Off screen, it was Ron's nightmare. The child star despised pickles so much that he once compared the taste to kerosene. Every bite he took for the cameras felt like torture, and the smiles and polite reactions you saw on screen were pure acting. The funny episode was, for Ron, a miserable ordeal of gagging down food he could barely stomach. What's more, Ron later admitted that the hardest part wasn't the chewing. It was pretending he liked it. He remembered constant grimacing, forcing his little body to hide his disgust for the sake of the laugh track. And while Ron is often described as the most beloved member of the cast, even that came with its own undertones. Crew members noticed that his unusually warm and easygoing relationship with Griffith wasn't just fatherly bonding, it was professional survival. Ron learned early that keeping Andy happy kept the set running smoothly. The boy may have been Mayberry's sweetheart, but behind the camera, he was learning the same lesson every adult actor already knew. Andy Griffith was the one you didn't cross. Even as a child actor, Ron Howard wasn't just Opie. He was already angling to be more than Mayberry's wide-eyed boy. He later admitted his input was respected respected on set. A rare privilege for a kid, but also a reminder that Griffith and the producers knew the show needed him as much as he needed them. Ron's curiosity behind the camera foreshadowed the career shift that would make him Hollywood's most successful escape artist. Because while many of his co-stars faded into obscurity or tragedy, Ron became the only one who truly transcended Mayberry.
So when we were doing like a revival, Return to Mayberry, or one of those interview sort of, specials.
Howard's trajectory is the stuff of Hollywood legend. From The Music Man, 1962, and The Courtship of Eddie's Father, 1963, to his breakout in American Graffiti, 1973, he built credibility as an actor before cementing TV stardom in Happy Days. But it wasn't Richie Cunningham who made Ron immortal. It was his directorial genius. The same boy forced to chew through Aunt Bee's revolting pickles grew up to win Oscars and sit among Hollywood royalty, collecting everything from the National Medal of Arts to 2 stars on the Walk of Fame. Ironically, the kid sidekick became the most powerful name to ever come out of the Andy Griffith Show, overshadowing Andy himself. Others weren't so lucky. Frances Bavier, forever known as Aunt Bee, shocked fans when she retired from acting and chose to spend the rest of her life not in New York or Hollywood, but in small-town North Carolina. The move was seen by some as a genuine embrace of the Mayberry lifestyle, but others whispered it was her way of retreating from an industry that had little interest in her once the show ended. She never married, never had children, and lived out her final years alone, sending inspirational letters to fans but avoiding much of the limelight. To some, it felt like art imitating life. Aunt Bee really was left behind. And then there was Jim Nabors. As Gomer Pyle, he became a fan favorite, so much so that CBS spun him off into Gomer Pyle USMC. His goofy persona belied a powerful operatic singing voice that carried him through variety shows and records. But behind the laughter and love songs was another controversy. Nabors was one of the first TV stars to live openly as a gay man, though Hollywood's PR machine in the 1960s and 70s worked overtime to bury that truth. His eventual marriage in 2013, after decades of speculation, proved just how much of his life he'd been forced to keep under wraps during his career peak.
Andy told me this, that in that very first season, the first episode, that my dad was an actor.
Yep.
Not a famous actor, but he was professional and working.
So while Mayberry projected wholesome perfection, the cast's lives after the cameras stopped rolling told a different story of child stars who outgrew the show, actresses who withdrew into solitude, and fan favorites who lived double lives under Hollywood's watchful eye. Jim Nabors shocked fans in 2013 when, at the age of 82, he publicly came out as gay and finally married his partner of 38 years. For decades, Nabors had lived a double life. Beloved as the bumbling Gomer Pyle while privately sharing a relationship he felt Hollywood forced him to hide. "I'm not ashamed," he said. "It was just so personal I didn't tell anybody." It was a bittersweet confession. A reminder that while Mayberry pretended to celebrate family values, one of its brightest stars had to keep his true love in the shadows until the industry finally loosened its grip. Annetta Corso, who played Helen Crump, Andy's schoolteacher love interest, kept busy in television long after Mayberry. She popped up in shows like Adam 12, House Calls, and even reunited with Griffith and Matlock. But her career never reached the heights fans once predicted. Despite her talent, Corso spent much of her career in supporting roles, overshadowed by her former co-star. She reprised Helen Crump in both reunion movies, but by the 1990s, her story turned tragic. In 1995, Annetta died of cancer at just 62, a quiet end for the woman who once played Mayberry's leading lady. And then there was Hal Smith, forever remembered as Otis Campbell, Mayberry's lovable town drunk. His portrayal raised eyebrows even back then, with critics pointing out how strange it was for a family show to present alcoholism as comic relief. But once the Andy Griffith Show ended, Smith reinvented himself in an entirely different arena: voice acting. He became the voice of Owl in Disney's Winnie the Pooh and countless other characters. The irony was thick. After years of playing a stumbling drunk, he gave his voice to children's characters, leaving behind Mayberry's bar stools for Disney's fairy tales. The stories of Nabors, Corso, and Smith prove that the legacy of the Andy Griffith Show wasn't as idyllic as Mayberry looked. Behind the charm were hidden identities, careers that fizzled, and actors who were remembered for roles they couldn't outrun. The many adventures of Winnie the Pooh might sound like a sweet bedtime story, but the man behind some of your favorite childhood voices lived a life far less innocent. Hal Smith wasn't just Winnie the Pooh's narrator. He gave life to characters like Uncle Tex on the Flintstones, Goliath on Davy and Goliath, and even the greedy Flintheart Glomgold on DuckTales. His voice was everywhere. The Jetsons, Top Cat, Scooby-Doo, Hong Kong Phooey, you name it. But behind the microphone, tragedy struck hard. When his wife Louise died in 1992, Hal's health crumbled. Just 2 years later, he was gone from a sudden heart attack, a shocking end for a man whose voice defined generations. And then there's George Lindsay, Goober Pyle himself. Hollywood painted him as the goofy sidekick, but few people know how deep his influence ran. Sure, he raised millions for the Special Olympics and had highways and film festivals named after him. But insiders whispered that Lindsay's generous public image was partly a way to outrun the typecasting curse that haunted him since the Andy Griffith Show. He wasn't just raising money, he was raising his reputation, fighting to be remembered as more than Mayberry's fool. Don Knotts, meanwhile, wasn't only Barney Fife, America's neurotic deputy. When Three's Company needed saving, he came crashing in as Ralph Furley, the over-the-top landlord. Fans loved him, but Hollywood wasn't always kind. Despite his comedic genius, Knotts was often dismissed as a one-trick pony. It took TV Guide ranking him among the 50 greatest TV stars of all time to finally cement his legend, a recognition that came decades too late. And then there's the heart of this saga, Andy and Don. What most fans don't realize is their friendship wasn't just strong, it was practically codependent. From No Time for Sergeants on Broadway in 1955 to their Mayberry days, they were a package deal. But the industry always tried to split them apart, offering Griffith prestige projects while Knotts got pigeonholed into nervous sidekicks. When Don died in 2006, Andy was there, refusing to let Hollywood's cold machinery erase their bond. And when Andy himself passed 6 years later, it wasn't just the end of an era. It was the final curtain call on one of television's greatest partnerships. So the question is, were these men simply beloved TV icons, or were they victims of a Hollywood system that used them up and threw them aside once their prime had passed? Which part of this story shocked you most? The tragic downfall, the hidden rivalry, or the way fame and typecasting haunted these so-called wholesome stars? Drop your thoughts below, because the truth about Mayberry isn't nearly as innocent as it looked on screen. That's it for today. See you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.